In the crowded impersonal chaos of a modern airport, a man's worth is often judged by the crispness of his suit or the gleam of his watch. But what happens when the system designed to serve everyone decides one person is unworthy based on the color of his skin and the simplicity of his clothes? This is the story of a routine flight from Chicago to Washington, D.C., a flight that became a flashpoint for prejudice and power. It's the story of two airline employees who chose mockery over service and the quiet, unassuming black man in seat 2A they decided to target. They had no idea their victim was not just any passenger. He was the most powerful man in American aviation, and he was taking notes. The air in Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 1 was a thick soup of anxiety-stale coffee and the faint ozone scent of hurried travelers. It was a symphony of rolling suitcases, garbled PA announcements, and the incessant, cheerful beeping of concession stand scanners. Dr. Jordan Reyes blended into this chaos perfectly. Dressed in a simple grey zip-up hoodie, dark travel pants, and a pair of well-worn but clean sneakers, he looked less like a man who held the safety of the entire nation's airspace in his hands, and more like a weary academic heading to a conference. That was precisely the point. Today, he was not Dr. Jordan Reyes, Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration. He was just Jordan Reyes' passenger ticket number 016-247-831092, flying on Aura Airlines Flight 815 to Washington, Dulles. This was a ghost ride, an unannounced inspection to experience the airline's operations from the passenger's perspective. It was a vital tool he used to see beyond the polished reports and sanitized data that crossed his desk. He wanted to see the truth of the system in its raw, unfiltered state. He was about to get more than he bargained for. The boarding line for Flight 815 was a tangled mess of first-class elites, anxious families, and road warrior consultants. The gate agent, a woman with a name badge that read Brenda, and a sour expression that suggested she'd been gargling lemon juice barked orders into a microphone. "We will now begin boarding Zone 1. Please have your boarding passes and identification ready. Zone 1 only." Jordan was in Zone 1 holding a first-class ticket. He waited his turn, patiently observing Brenda's interactions. She offered a tight, professional smile to a man in a tailored suit, a warm, "have a great flight," to a blonde woman with a designer handbag. When Jordan stepped up, the warmth vanished, replaced by a frosty impatience. He handed her his phone with the digital boarding pass displayed. She scanned it. A soft negative beep echoed from the machine. She scanned it again. Beep. "Sir, there's a problem with your ticket," she said, her voice loud enough for the people behind him to hear. She didn't make eye contact, instead, glaring at her screen. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jordan replied calmly. "Is it something you can resolve here?" Brenda sighed, a theatrical gust of air meant to convey profound inconvenience. "It's showing an error. Are you sure you're on the right flight? This is the flight to Washington, Dulles." "Yes, I'm quite sure," Jordan said, keeping his voice even. The man behind him, also in a suit, shifted his weight impatiently. Brenda tapped her long acrylic nails on the counter. "Well, your seat is 2A, first class." She finally looked at him, her eyes flicking over his simple attire from his hoodie down to his sneakers. The look was a comprehensive dismissal, a judgment rendered in a fraction of a second. She leaned in, conspiratorially, but her whisper was a stage whisper, designed to be overheard. "Sometimes the system makes mistakes and puts people in the wrong cabin. I can try to find you a seat in the main cabin where you're supposed to be." The insult was as sharp as a shard of glass. It wasn't just a suggestion of a system error. It was a public declaration that he didn't belong. The implication was clear. Someone like you could never afford to be here legitimately. A faint murmur rippled through the line. The man behind him scoffed quietly. Jordan felt a familiar hot sting of anger, an old ghost he had learned to chain down long ago. His instinct was to flash his credentials, to watch the arrogant certainty on her face crumble into panic. But that would defeat the entire purpose of the inspection. He was here to observe the system under normal conditions, and tragically this was normal for too many people. He took a slow, deliberate breath. "Could you please try running the ticket number manually? Perhaps it's a glitch with the QR code." He spoke with a quiet authority that seemed to momentarily surprise her. With another exaggerated sigh, Brenda punched in the long string of numbers. Her eyes widened for a split second before her professional mask of indifference slammed back down. The screen in front of her had undoubtedly flashed his name, his status, and cleared the ticket. The error had miraculously vanished. She printed out a paper boarding pass and slapped it onto the counter without a word. She didn't hand it to him. "Thank you," Jordan said, picking it up. "Just have your pass ready for the flight attendant," she mumbled, refusing to meet his gaze. She immediately called out, "Next." Her voice, once again, bright and falsely cheerful for the suited man who had been waiting behind him. As Jordan walked down the jet bridge, he made a mental note. Gate Agent Brenda Larson, ORD. Unprofessional conduct, discriminatory screening, public humiliation of a passenger. He discreetly pulled out his phone, not to check emails, but to open a secure, encrypted note-taking app. He typed in the time, the gate number, and the agent's name. The flight hadn't even left the ground, and Aura Airlines was already failing its inspection. He had a sinking feeling it was only the beginning. The atmosphere inside the aircraft, an Airbus A321, was a stark contrast to the gate's chaos. Soft lighting, the gentle hum of the auxiliary power unit, and the plush leather of the first-class cabin were all designed to create a bubble of tranquility. Jordan found his seat 2A, a spacious window seat with ample legroom. He stowed his simple backpack containing not much more than a tablet, a notebook, and a bottle of water in the overhead bin, and settled in. As he did, he saw Brenda Larson, the gate agent, step onto the plane to hand some final paperwork to the cabin crew. She leaned in and whispered something to the lead flight attendant at the galley, a man in his late 30s with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His name tag read Keith. As Brenda whispered, her eyes darted towards Jordan for a brief moment. Keith's gaze followed hers, and a smirk of shared understanding flickered across his face. He nodded subtly. The baton of contempt had been passed. Jordan knew then that his journey was about to get significantly more illuminating. He sat back, adopted a neutral expression, and continued his silent observation. Keith began his pre-departure service. "Can I get you something to drink before we take off, Sir Champagne Orange Juice?" he asked the man in 1A. "And for you, ma'am, to the woman in 1B. He moved through the cabin with a practiced oily charm. He took the order of the businessman in 2B next to Jordan, laughing at a small joke the man made. Then he turned to Jordan. The smile vanished. "You need anything?" he asked, the warmth and deference gone from his tone. It wasn't an offer. It was a challenge. "I'll have a sparkling water with a slice of lime, please," Jordan said politely. Keith scoffed a tiny, almost inaudible sound. Don't have any lime until we're in the air. Just the water." He didn't wait for a reply, turning on his heel and heading back to the galley. Minutes later, he returned with the other passengers' drinks on a silver tray. He served the man in 2B his scotch with a flourish. He walked right past Jordan without his water proceeding to serve the passengers in the rows behind. It was a deliberate, calculated snub. Jordan didn't react. He simply watched, cataloguing the behavior. He wasn't just a passenger being ignored. He was an inspector, witnessing a willful breach of service protocol. The boarding door was finally closed, and Keith began the safety demonstration with the forced enthusiasm of a children's television host. As he pointed out the emergency exits, his eyes briefly met Jordan's, holding a flicker of something that looked like disdain. Once the plane reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign pinged off and the cabin service began in earnest. Keith took meal orders. He leaned in close to the other passengers, speaking in low, respectful tones. "For your main course today, Mr. Henderson, we have a seared salmon or the filet mignon. The filet is particularly good." When he arrived at Jordan's seat, he remained standing upright, speaking down to him. "Salmon or beef? No description, no pleasantries. I'll have the filet, please. Medium rare," Jordan specified. Keith scribbled on his pad. "Can't guarantee the temperature," he said flatly, before moving on. The meal service was another masterclass in passive aggression. Jordan's meal was the last one to be brought out. The filet was cooked well done, almost tough. When Keith placed the tray on his table, he accidentally sloshed Jordan's water glass, spilling a small puddle onto Jordan's pants. "Oh, clumsy me," Keith said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. He dabbed at the spill with a flimsy cocktail napkin, making it worse. "These things happen." He walked away without another word, leaving Jordan with a damp leg and a cold meal. Jordan took a bite of the overcooked beef. He ate in silence. He wasn't angry. He was focused. This was no longer just about one rude gate agent or one snide flight attendant. This was a pattern. This was a culture of disrespect that was being actively fostered and communicated between employees. And if this was how they treated a passenger in their most expensive cabin, how were they treating people in the back? He discreetly took out his phone again, angling it away from his neighbor. He opened his secure app and began to type. Flight attendant Keith Garrett. Continuation of discriminatory behavior initiated at gate. Deliberate service degradation. Refusal of standard pre-departure beverage. Hostile tone and language. Willful service delays. Suspected intentional food quality sabotage and minor physical aggression. Spill. He paused, then added a new line. Systemic issue assessment. High probability of cultural rot within frontline staff. Lack of oversight and accountability. This behavior suggests a deeper failure of management. He sent a text to a secure number. It was to David Chen, his deputy administrator, waiting on the ground in Washington. On board AU-815. Active observation ongoing. Documenting significant service and conduct violations. Stand by. The reply came back almost instantly. Understood, sir. Team is on standby. Let us know what you need. Jordan put his phone away. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a federal official conducting a field investigation. Keith and Brenda thought they were mocking a nobody. They had no idea they were performing their little drama of prejudice on the most unforgiving stage imaginable. An hour into the flight, with the remnants of the disappointing meal service cleared away, Jordan decided it was time to move from passive observation to an active test. A crew's response to a simple direct request under non-stressful conditions was often more revealing than their behavior during the choreographed routines of boarding and mealtime. It measured their fundamental disposition towards passenger service and safety. He located the flight attendant call button on his armrest. It was a small, unassuming button, but in the context of aviation regulations, it was a direct line of communication, a request for assistance that was not to be trifled with. He pressed it. A soft blue light illuminated above his seat, and a gentle chime echoed through the quiet cabin. And then nothing. Jordan didn't press it again. The test was not one of persistence, but of response time. He marked the time on his watch. He watched Keith emerge from the forward galley. Keith saw the light. Their eyes met for a fleeting second. Jordan saw a flicker of annoyance in the flight attendant's expression, before Keith deliberately turned his attention to the rearranging coffee mugs his back now to the cabin. 1 minute passed, then 2. Keith busied himself with trivial tasks, polishing an already clean countertop, chatting with another flight attendant. The blue light above Jordan's seat remained lit, a silent, glowing indictment of neglect. Beside him, the businessman in 2B, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had been engrossed in his laptop, noticed the delay. He glanced from the light to Keith, then to Jordan, a look of confusion on his face. In the row across the aisle, a young woman who had been reading a book also seemed to notice. She looked at the lit call button with a furrowed brow. The inaction was becoming conspicuous. After 5 full minutes, an eternity in aviation service terms for a non-emergency call in a half-full first-class cabin. Keith finally sauntered over. He didn't apologize for the delay. He didn't even ask what Jordan needed. "You pushed the button?" He stated, his arms crossed. It was an accusation, not a question. "Yes," Jordan replied, his voice calm and measured. "I'd like another glass of water, please." Keith's face tightened. It was such a minor, simple request that denying it would be impossible. But his ego, already inflated by the power trip he was on, seemed to take it as a personal affront. He felt he had established a dynamic where Jordan was to be ignored, and Jordan was now refusing to play his assigned role. "I'll get to it when I'm finished with my cabin checks." Keith snapped, his voice low but sharp. This was the moment of escalation. This was not just poor service anymore. This was a direct refusal of a crew member to comply with a standard passenger request. Jordan's internal calculus shifted. The Code of Federal Regulations, Title 14, outlines the duties of a flight attendant. Jordan said, his voice still quiet, but now laced with an unmistakable edge of steel. "Among them is attending to passenger needs. I am requesting a glass of water." He hadn't raised his voice, but the sudden specific invocation of federal regulations had a stunning effect. Keith's smug demeanor faltered. He was accustomed to dealing with irate businessmen or demanding celebrities, not someone who calmly quoted FAA chapter and verse. For the first time, a sliver of uncertainty pierced his arrogance. "Who was this guy?" "Are you threatening me?" Keith hissed, trying to regain control. "I'm stating a fact and making a request," Jordan corrected him gently. "A request I have now made twice. Your response is being noted." The businessman in 2B stopped typing on his laptop and was now watching the exchange with undisguised interest. The young woman across the aisle had put her book down, backed into a corner by a passenger who was inexplicably calm and unnervingly knowledgeable. Keith's professionalism completely dissolved. He spun around, marched to the galley, and returned not with a glass, but with a small plastic bottle of water unchilled. He didn't place it on the tray table. He practically slammed it down, the plastic cracking against the wood finish. "Here. Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice seething with resentment. "No, thank you. That will be all," Jordan said, looking directly at him. Keith stormed off toward the front of the plane, but not before casting a final venomous glare. He disappeared beyond the curtain into the forward galley, and Jordan could hear his agitated, raised voice as he began speaking to the other flight attendant. Jordan picked up the bottle of water. He didn't drink it. He turned it over in his hands, his expression thoughtful. The test was a resounding failure. The crew member's response to a simple request was not just delayed, but hostile, insubordinate, and unprofessional. If this was how he handled a request for water, how would he react in a genuine emergency? A medical issue, a security concern. The implications were chilling. He reached for his phone once more. The text to David Chen was longer this time. Active test initiated. Call button pressed at 14:32 CST. Response delayed by 5 minutes, 14 seconds. FA Keith Garrett responded with hostility and initial refusal. Invoked CFR Title 14 to compel compliance. FA behavior escalated to overt aggression. This indicates a severe deficit in crew training and temperament. Potential safety risk. Move to Phase 3. The reply was terse. Phase 3 initiated. Team is preparing. Awaiting your signal. Jordan put the phone away. The signal would be his final assessment to be delivered upon landing. The fate of Aura Airlines Flight 805's crew was now all but sealed. The only question left was how much worse it would get before they touched down in Dulles. Keith Garrett was fuming. He felt challenged, embarrassed, and most of all enraged that the passenger in 2A, the one Brenda had warned him about, the one who looked like he'd won his ticket in a raffle, had the audacity to question him. In his mind, the cabin was his domain. He was the authority figure, the one in charge. The confrontation had been a direct assault on that authority. He stormed past the galley curtain and, on a wave of pure indignation, made a decision that would prove to be catastrophic. He buzzed the cockpit. Flight deck Captain Mitchell. A calm, gravelly voice answered. "Captain, it's Keith. I need a word. I have a problem, passenger." There was a slight pause. A problem? What kind of problem? Disruptive? Belligerent? Keith lied, his voice laced with manufactured urgency. "He's in 2A, arguing with me, quoting regulations, trying to intimidate me. I'm concerned he may become a security issue." This was a serious accusation. The phrase security issue is a tripwire in the aviation world, one that demands a captain's immediate and full attention. Captain Robert Mitchell, a veteran pilot with nearly 30 years of experience, should have known the correct procedure. The protocol was clear. Gather information from all available sources, and if possible, make a direct personal assessment of the situation before taking any action that could escalate it. But Captain Mitchell was in the final stretch of a long 4-day trip. He was tired, thinking more about the steak dinner he was going to have at home than about a squabble in the first-class cabin. He trusted his lead flight attendant. Keith had been with the airline for a decade. The passenger was an unknown quantity. Mitchell made a critical error in judgment. He took his flight attendant's word as gospel. "All right, Keith, I'll handle it. Keep an eye on him. Let me know if he makes another move." Mitchell said, his voice grim. He didn't ask what the passenger had said. He didn't ask what started the confrontation. He didn't suggest observing the passenger from a distance. He simply accepted the biased, exaggerated report of his angry crew member. A few moments later, the PA system crackled to life. "Folks, this is your captain speaking from the flight deck." Mitchell's voice boomed through the cabin, suddenly stern and commanding. "Just a reminder that federal law requires all passengers to comply with crew member instructions. We have a zero-tolerance policy for any form of interference or intimidation of our cabin crew. For the safety and comfort of everyone on board, please remain courteous and compliant. Thank you." The message, while seemingly general, was a precision-guided missile aimed directly at Seat 2A. Every passenger in the first-class cabin knew exactly who the captain was talking about. The businessman next to Jordan shot him a wary, distrustful look before pointedly angling his body away. The young woman across the aisle, who had looked sympathetic before, now stared down at her book, her cheeks flushed with discomfort. Jordan was no longer just a target of the crew. He had been painted as a threat to the entire flight. Jordan sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask, but inside his assessment had reached a critical turning point. This was no longer about a few rogue employees exhibiting prejudice. This was a catastrophic failure of the chain of command. The captain, the ultimate authority on the aircraft, responsible for every soul on board, had acted recklessly. He had taken a one-sided, unverified report and used his position to publicly intimidate a passenger. He hadn't left the cockpit. He hadn't sought a second opinion. He hadn't attempted to de-escalate. Instead, he had thrown gasoline on a fire. What if Jordan had been an unruly passenger? This announcement would have only enraged him further. What if he was having a medical or psychological crisis? This would have isolated and terrified him. In any scenario, the captain's action was wrong. It was a failure of leadership, a failure of protocol, and a profound failure of judgment. The silent, methodical note-taking in Jordan's mind was now a deafening alarm. This wasn't just a cultural rot anymore. This was a clear and present danger to the safety management system of the entire airline. If this was the standard for command decisions on a routine flight, what other corners were being cut? What other safety procedures were being ignored? The die was cast. He owed it not just to himself, but to every passenger who had ever been mistreated, and every person who would fly on this airline in the future to see this through to its absolute conclusion. He pulled out his phone one last time before the descent began. The flight attendants were preparing the cabin for landing, their movements brisk and efficient, a veneer of normalcy over the rot beneath. He typed a short, coded message to David Chen. "Command level protocol breach confirmed. Captain has engaged in passenger intimidation without direct assessment based on false report from FAA. Systemic failure is total. Signal is sentinel. Execute full ramp inspection upon arrival. No advance notice to airline. I want everyone held at the gate." The reply was immediate. "Signal sentinel received and confirmed. Ground teams are moving into position. Dulles Tower has been notified to direct you to a holding gate. They are waiting for you, sir." Jordan switched his phone to airplane mode and put it away. He looked out the window as the plane began its descent through the clouds, the familiar landscape of Northern Virginia spreading out below. In the galley, Keith was smiling, vindicated. He believed he had won. He and Brenda would have a good laugh about it later. The captain felt he had deftly handled a minor disruption, a footnote in a long career. They were all blissfully unaware that they were not flying toward a routine stop. They were flying into a reckoning of their own, making a reckoning that was patiently waiting for them on the tarmac. The landing at Washington Dulles International Airport was smooth. Captain Mitchell's skills as a pilot were by all accounts excellent. It was his judgment as a commander that had failed. As the Airbus A3221 taxied off the active runway, the passengers began their familiar ritual of gathering belongings and turning on their phones. A sense of relief and anticipation filled the cabin. Keith Garrett walked through the first-class section, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. He made a point of making eye contact with Jordan, a look that said, "See, we're in charge here." Jordan simply met his gaze with a placid, unblinking stare that seemed to unnerve the flight attendant slightly. Then something unusual happened. Instead of heading toward the familiar C or D concourses, the aircraft made a slow turn onto a remote taxiway, eventually coming to a stop at an isolated hardstand far from the main terminal. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the PA again this time, with a note of confusion. Folks, a little unexpected delay here. Air traffic control has directed us to a holding position. We're being told there's some unexpected ramp activity at our assigned gate. We'll let you know more as soon as we get an update. Please remain seated for now." A groan of annoyance went through the cabin. Passengers craned their necks to look out the windows, seeing only empty tarmac and distant service vehicles. In the cockpit, Captain Mitchell was on the radio with ground control, his voice tight with irritation. "Dulles Ground, Aura 815. What's the reason for the hold? We have passengers with tight connections. Aura 815, hold your position," the disembodied voice from the tower replied, offering no explanation. "You are to await instructions from ground personnel." Minutes stretched into an uncomfortable eternity. Then through the cockpit window, Captain Mitchell saw them. Two dark SUVs with government plates were driving across the tarmac, followed by a passenger shuttle bus. They weren't airport operations vehicles. They looked official. They drove directly toward the craft and parked near the forward stairs. Several figures in dark jackets emerged. On the back of each jacket, in bold yellow letters, were 3 words that every pilot dreads seeing unannounced: Federal Aviation Administration. A cold knot of dread began to form in Captain Mitchell's stomach. A ramp inspection. Here now. They were usually scheduled, or at the very least, a heads-up was given to the airline's station manager. This was an ambush. His mind raced. Was it a random check, or was it something more? Did they get a tip-off about something? Maintenance logs, crew rest violations. The lead ground agent signaled for the jet bridge to be connected. The aircraft door was opened by Keith, who expected to see the usual Dulles gate agent. Instead, he was met by 4 stern-faced individuals. One of them, a sharp-looking man of Asian descent, with a tablet in his hand, stepped forward. "This is an official FAA inspection," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "This aircraft is not to be moved. The entire flight and cabin crew are to remain on board. Please begin deplaning the passengers." Keith's jaw went slack. His smugness evaporated, replaced by sheer panic. He and the other flight attendants numbly began the deplaning process, their earlier arrogance forgotten. As passengers filed out, they stared curiously at the grim-faced officials standing by the door. Jordan Reyes remained in his seat, seemingly engrossed in a magazine, as if he were just another passenger waiting for the crowd to thin. He watched as Mr. Henderson from 2B hurried off, casting one last suspicious glance his way. He saw the young woman from across the aisle leave her face a mask of confusion. Finally, the cabin was empty, except for the flight crew and Jordan. Keith, the other flight attendants, and the first officer stood huddled in the galley, whispering nervously. Captain Mitchell emerged from the cockpit, his face pale. "What in God's name is going on?" he demanded, walking toward the lead inspector. The inspector, David Chen, didn't answer him. His eyes scanned the nearly empty cabin and locked onto the man sitting quietly by the window in seat 2A. A look of recognition and profound respect washed over David's face. He walked past the stunned captain down the aisle and stopped next to Jordan's seat. The entire crew watched, utterly bewildered. David Chen inclined his head slightly. "Dr. Reyes," he said, his voice clear and resonant in the quiet cabin. "Welcome back to Washington. I trust your flight was illuminating." Jordan slowly folded his magazine and placed it in the seat pocket. He looked up at his deputy. "Illuminating is one word for it, David." He then stood up, and as he did, his entire demeanor shifted. The weary, unassuming traveler vanished, replaced by an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. He was no longer a man in a simple hoodie. He was the center of gravity in the room. He turned to face the dumbstruck crew. Keith Garrett's face had drained of all color. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Captain Mitchell's mouth hung open as the pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The problem passenger. The man in 2A. Dr. Reyes. David Chen drove the final nail into the coffin. He turned to the captain and made the formal introduction. "Captain Mitchell, allow me to introduce my boss," he said, his voice ringing with cold formality. "Dr. Jordan Reyes, the Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of careers crashing and burning, the sound of arrogance meeting its final, unmovable consequence. The quiet man they had mocked, ignored, and threatened was not just a passenger. He was the man who wrote the very rules they had so arrogantly broken. And their flight was far from over. The interior of the Airbus A321, once a stage for petty tyranny, was now a silent, sterile courtroom. The thick, sound-dampening insulation of the fuselage seemed to absorb every noise, creating a heavy, expectant quiet. The flight crew of Aura 8 and 15 stood huddled near the forward galley, a tight knot of anxiety. Their whispers were sharp, frantic hisses, their professional composure having evaporated the moment they saw the FAA jackets at the door. Captain Mitchell had emerged from the cockpit, his face a mask of controlled fury and confusion, a commander demanding answers in his own domain. He saw the grim-faced officials, the unusual hold on the remote hard stand, and a situation spiraling far beyond a simple ramp check. And then there was the passenger in 2A. The quiet man in the grey hoodie who had been the source of all this friction. He had not deplaned. He remained in his seat, calmly reading a magazine, as if he were simply waiting for the crowd to thin. His stillness was unnerving, a placid island in a sea of their rising panic. He was the center of the storm, yet he appeared untouched by it. Captain Mitchell strode down the aisle, his pilot's uniform a suit of armor that suddenly felt flimsy. "What in God's name is going on?" he demanded, directing his question to the lead FAA agent who had boarded. "You can't just commandeer a commercial aircraft without an explanation." The lead inspector, a man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a name badge that read David Chen, didn't so much as glance at the captain. His full attention, and that of his team, was fixed further down the aisle. His gaze scanned the now empty cabin and locked onto the man sitting by the window. A profound and unmistakable shift occurred in Chen's demeanor. The stern, bureaucratic mask dissolved, replaced by an expression of deep professional respect. He walked past the stunned captain, his footsteps echoing in the silent cabin, and stopped beside seat 2A. The entire crew watched their confusion mounting into sheer bewilderment. Why was the lead federal agent ignoring the captain and approaching him? David Chen inclined his head slightly, a gesture of deference that was utterly out of place on the contested ground of an official inspection. "Dr. Reyes," he said, his voice clear and resonant in the quiet space. "Welcome back to Washington. I trust your flight was illuminating." The word hung in the air, weighted with a dense, bitter irony that made Keith Garrett's blood run cold. The man in the hoodie, Dr. Reyes, slowly folded his magazine, creasing it with meticulous care, and placed it in the seat-back pocket. He looked up at his deputy, and a hint of weary resignation touched his features. "Illuminating is one word for it, David, and deeply concerning." He then stood up, and in that simple act of rising to his feet, everything changed. His posture, his presence, his very essence seemed to transform. The weary, unassuming traveler vanished, replaced by an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. The simple grey hoodie seemed to recede, and in its place stood a figure of immense power, a man who was not a guest in this space, but its ultimate arbiter. He was no longer a passenger on an airplane. He was the center of gravity in the room. He turned to face the dumbstruck crew. Keith Garrett's face had drained of all color, his skin taking on a waxy, translucent quality. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost from a nightmare he didn't even know he was having. Captain Mitchell's mouth hung agape, his mind frantically trying to process the impossible scene before him. The problem passenger. The man in 2A. The name Dr. Reyes. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with the horrifying, deafening sound of a guillotine being released. David Chen, with a cold, precise formality, drove the final nail into the coffin. He turned to the captain, who was now utterly ignored and irrelevant in the exchange. "Captain Mitchell, allow me to introduce my boss," he said, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Dr. Jordan Reyes, the Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked all the air and arrogance out of the cabin. It was the sound of careers crashing and burning, the sound of reality reasserting itself with brutal, unforgiving force. The quiet man they had mocked, ignored, and threatened was not just a passenger. He was the man who wrote the very rules they had so arrogantly broken, the man whose signature was on the licenses that gave them the privilege of flying. And their flight, he now made clear, was far from over. Dr. Reyes took a measured step forward. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud or angry. It was worse. It was the calm, dissecting voice of a surgeon identifying a cancer. He addressed Captain Mitchell, first leader to leader. "Captain," he began, "you are the pilot in command. That title is not honorary. It is a sacred trust. It signifies that the ultimate authority and the ultimate responsibility for every soul on this aircraft rests with you. Today that trust was broken. That responsibility failed." Mitchell, visibly trembling, now opened his mouth to stammer an excuse, a defense, anything. Jordan held up a single steady hand, and the captain's words died in his throat. "You received a report from your flight attendant about a problem passenger. Your training, your experience, and the code of federal regulations all demanded that you verify that report, that you assess the situation for yourself before taking any action. You did not. You remained insulated in your locked cockpit, a world away from the reality of the cabin. You took a single, uncorroborated and emotional report as fact, and you chose to escalate. You used the PA system, your voice of authority, to publicly intimidate a passenger who had done nothing more than request a glass of water. You didn't de-escalate a conflict, Captain. You became a willing participant in one. You created a hostile environment based on a lie." Jordan paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle. "Your primary duty is the safety of this flight, By demonstrating such a profound lack of curiosity, by failing to perform the most basic due diligence, you demonstrated a catastrophic lapse in judgment. What if I had been a passenger in medical distress? What if I was someone who reacted poorly to your public threat? Your actions could have led to panic or worse. Your command is compromised. He turned his head slightly toward David Chen, never taking his eyes off Mitchell. Mr. Chen, see to it that Captain Mitchell's airline transport pilot license is placed under immediate and indefinite review. He is grounded effective immediately pending a full inquiry and mandatory retraining in crew resource management, threat assessment and de-escalation protocols. If he ever flies again, it will be because we are satisfied this will never happen again. David nodded grimly. Yes, Administrator. Mitchell seemed to shrink inside his uniform, the crisp fabric suddenly looking 2 sizes too large for him. The decades of pride, the thousands of safe landings, the entire edifice of his career, all of it crumbled to dust in that single moment. He could only nod, a broken man. Next, Jordan's calm, penetrating gaze shifted to Keith Garrett. The flight attendant, who had been leaning against a galley counter for support, flinched as if he had been physically struck. Mr. Garrett, Jordan said, his voice dropping a register, becoming colder, sharper. Your performance today was not just a failure of service. It was a malicious and targeted campaign of harassment and discrimination. It began with a whispered conspiracy with the gate agent at O'Hare. Yes, we observed that too. It continued with deliberate service denial, verbal insolence, and physical carelessness. He took another slow step forward, closing the distance. But you went further. You filed a false inflammatory report to the captain. You used trigger words, belligerent, security issue, to intentionally mislead your commander and escalate a situation of your own creation. Let me be very clear, knowingly providing false information that interferes with the duties of a flight crew is a federal offense. You didn't just try to get a passenger in trouble. You endangered this aircraft by distracting the flight deck with a fiction born of your own prejudice. You are a liability not just to your airline's reputation, but to its safety certificate. Jordan looked at one of the other FAA inspectors. This man's flight attendant certification is suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. Aura Airlines will be advised in the strongest possible terms to terminate his employment. And we will be exploring federal charges for interference with a flight crew. Keith's legs finally gave out. He slid down the galley counter, slumping into a heap on the floor, his face buried in his hands as a ragged sob escaped his lips. His life's work, his identity had been dismantled, piece by painful piece in less than a minute. Finally, Jordan's eyes swept the galley and fell upon the manifest paperwork. The gate agent at ORD, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Her name was Brenda Larson. One of the other flight attendants, a young woman who had wisely remained silent and horrified throughout the ordeal, nodded meekly. Her actions initiated this entire sequence. Jordan stated, his voice resonating with the cold logic of an incident report. Her discriminatory assumptions, her public attempt to shame a passenger, and her clear communication of that prejudice to the cabin crew set a toxic tone. She poisoned this flight before it ever left the gate. He looked back at David. David, I want a formal notice of investigation sent to Aura Airlines' corporate headquarters before they open for business tomorrow. The scope is to be a full top-to-bottom review of their employee training programs on implicit bias, passenger rights, and professional conduct. The investigation starts with the ORD station, specifically with Ms. Larson. This rot is deep, and we are going to find the source. The chilling finality in the air was suddenly broken by a hesitant voice from the aircraft door. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. It was the young woman who had been sitting across the aisle from Jordan. She had lingered by the jet bridge, her curiosity piqued by the official presence. She had sensed this was more than just a delay. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, stepping just inside the plane, her eyes wide. "But I saw what happened. I saw everything. I saw the flight attendant ignore him, spill water on him, and slam that bottle down. I heard the captain's announcement, and I knew it was about him. It was wrong. What they did was wrong. If you need a witness, if he—" she gestured toward the whimpering form of Keith Garrett. "Tries to deny it, I'll testify. I'll tell them what I saw." A small, almost imperceptible smile of gratitude touched Dr. Reyes's lips. "Thank you, ma'am. We appreciate that. An agent will take your statement." Her unsolicited validation was the final piece. It wasn't just his word. It was seen. It was recognized. The FAA team began their work with cold efficiency. The crew was formally relieved of their duties. They were not allowed to gather their belongings, but were informed they would be escorted off the plane to be interviewed one by one. Their confident swagger was gone, replaced by the shuffling, downcast gait of the condemned. As Keith and Captain Mitchell were led away, their eyes met Jordan's one last time. There was no defiance left, only the devastating, soul-crushing understanding of the magnitude of their mistake. They hadn't just insulted a man in a hoodie. They had insulted the very institution that governed their entire existence, and it was an insult that would cost them everything. The fallout from the Airline's Flight 859 incident, as it was immediately codenamed within the FAA, was not a slow burn. It was a detonation. Before the last of the deplaned passengers had even found their way to the main terminal via shuttle bus, the story had already begun its viral escape. A ramp worker, seeing the unannounced arrival of multiple black SUVs with government plates surrounding an Airlines jet, had snapped a photo. Another overhearing a frantic radio call mentioning the FAA Administrator's presence on board added the critical piece of context. The combination was explosive. By the time the sun set on the East Coast, the rumor had morphed into a verified leak, and the news cycle had its teeth firmly clamped onto the story. The first headline from a major online news syndicate was a digital thunderclap. FAA Administrator flying incognito exposes shocking discrimination aboard Airlines. At Airlines corporate headquarters in Dallas, the news landed with the force of a physical blow. In the gleaming top-floor boardroom, CEO Gregory Pike stared at the headline projected on a massive screen, his face a stony mask of disbelief. Phones began to ring with a frantic, unending chorus. The head of public relations was pale, stammering about getting ahead of the narrative, a narrative that was already a runaway train. The chief operating officer was frantically trying to get a straight story from the Dulles station manager, who could only relay the terrifying facts. Flight 815's entire crew had been detained for questioning by federal agents on the tarmac. The next morning, the financial markets delivered their own brutal verdict. When the opening bell rang on Wall Street, Airline's stock ticker symbol. Aura didn't just dip, it hemorrhaged. Traders and algorithms, spooked by the combination of a PR nightmare and the looming threat of massive federal penalties, began a mass sell-off. Gregory Pike watched the numbers on the screen turn a bloody red, the stock price plummeting by nearly 20% in the first hour of trading. $1 billion of market value vanished into thin air, a fortune erased by the prejudice of a gate agent and the arrogance of a flight attendant. The human cost, however, was far more personal. In Chicago, Brenda Larson was called into her manager's office midway through her shift. She entered with a nervous swagger, ready to complain about a scheduling issue, but was met with an icy silence. There was no discussion, no review of her file. There was only a printed copy of the news article on the desk next to a termination letter. Her employee ID was deactivated before she even reached the door. For Captain Robert Mitchell, the end was quieter, but no less devastating. In a sterile meeting room at the pilots' union headquarters, he was presented with his options. He could face a lengthy public and career-ending FAA tribunal, or he could take an immediate early retirement. Stripped of his authority and his pride, he chose the latter. It was an ignominious end to a 30-year career, a lifetime of skill and dedication, undone by a single catastrophic failure of judgment, a lazy deference to a crew member's petty grievance. He would never again feel the thrill of guiding a great machine through the clouds. His wings clipped not by mechanical failure, but by a moral one. Keith Garrett faced the gravest consequences. 2 days after the flight, as he sat in his apartment, endlessly replaying his own arrogance in his mind, there was a sharp knock on his door. It wasn't an airline representative. It was a U.S. Marshal. He was served with a formal notice of impending federal charges for interference with a flight crew by providing a false security report. His actions were no longer just grounds for termination. They were a crime. The smirk he had worn so proudly on Flight 815 was now replaced by a mask of cold, dawning horror. The system he had mocked had turned its full, unforgiving weight upon him. While the perpetrators faced their individual reckonings, Gregory Pike was forced to face the public. At a hastily assembled press conference, flanked by grim-faced lawyers, he offered a profound and unreserved apology to Dr. Reyes and to the American public. He promised a full internal investigation and new sensitivity training. But the words rang hollow. The reporters' questions were like daggers probing the rotten core the incident had exposed. Mr. Pike, is this an isolated incident, or is this evidence of a toxic corporate culture at Aura Airlines? But for Dr. Jordan Reyes, the apologies and the firings were merely the first step. Punishment was a temporary salve. Prevention was the cure. He had been given a rare, unassailable mandate for sweeping reform, one forged in the crucible of personal humiliation. He intended to use it. 2 months later, in a packed auditorium at the Department of Transportation headquarters, he stood before an audience of airline CEOs, union leaders, and the national press to announce the Dignity in the Skies initiative. He didn't recount his personal story. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew it. Instead, he spoke with the calm, unwavering authority of a man who had seen the system's failures from the inside out. The safety of our airspace is a complex chain. He began, his voice steady. Every link matters. From the engineer who signs off on a turbine blade to the pilot who executes a landing. But we have overlooked a critical link, the human one, the link of dignity. Because a failure in human dignity can be as dangerous as a failure in hydraulics. A culture of disrespect can lead to a culture of negligence. He then laid out the 4 pillars of his initiative, each one a direct response to the failures of Flight 815. He mandated annual rigorous implicit bias and de-escalation training so that no employee, as he put it, confuses their personal prejudice with professional protocol. He instituted a new Passenger Bill of Rights to be displayed at every gate, ensuring that no traveler would be left to guess at the standard of treatment they were owed. He announced a streamlined direct-to-FAA complaint system for discrimination, a tool to ensure that no passenger's voice like his almost was, could be ignored, dismissed, or silenced by a corporation's internal processes. Finally, He unveiled strengthened protocols for cockpit cabin communication, ensuring that a captain's authority would henceforth be paired with an inescapable responsibility for direct assessment. The initiative became law with stunning speed, backed by overwhelming public and political will. Months later, the final scene of the drama unfolded not on an airplane, but in a sterile FAA briefing room. Dr. Reyes was addressing the newest class of aviation safety inspectors, the next generation of ghost riders. The young, eager faces looked up at him awaiting instructions. "Your job is more than checking logbooks and inspecting engine turbines," he told them, his voice resonating with hard-won experience. "Your job is to see the whole picture, the technical and the human. I need you to understand that the human factor is not just about pilot error or fatigue. It is about culture. It is about respect." He walked over to the window which overlooked the busy runways of Reagan National Airport, a constant ballet of takeoffs and landings. "A few months ago, I was on a flight where the crew saw my clothes before they saw me. They saw my skin color before they saw a passenger. They made a judgment, and in doing so, they failed their most fundamental duty. Not just to me, but to the trust that every person places in our system when they step onto a plane." He watched as an airliner gracefully lifted into the sky, climbing toward the clouds. "They never knew who I was. But that shouldn't matter. It must never matter. Every single person who buys a ticket and trusts their life to that flight crew deserves to be treated with professionalism and respect. Whether they are a CEO in a tailored suit or a student in a zip-up hoodie. Your job is to be the guardians of that promise. Go out there and see the system for what it really is, in all its complexity and with all its flaws, and where it is broken." He concluded, turning back to face them, his eyes filled with a quiet, steely resolve. "You fix it." In the reflection on the glass, a man stood watching the plane disappear into the blue expanse, a man whose quiet dignity had weathered a storm of prejudice and in return had changed the very climate of the skies. So what's the real takeaway from Dr. Reyes's story? It's a powerful reminder that prejudice and arrogance carry a price, and sometimes karma doesn't just knock, it breaks down the door. The actions of Brenda and Keith weren't just rude. They were a symptom of a deeper problem, one that their target was uniquely positioned to solve. This story shows that one person's quiet dignity in the face of ugliness can trigger an earthquake of change, leading to reforms that protect us all. It proves that a person's character isn't defined by the clothes they wear, but by how they wield the power they have. If this story of justice served cold resonated with you, please hit that like button to help us share it with more people. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more true stories of karma and consequence. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update.